Most people think Greek mythology is all gods and heroes, but beneath the famous stories lie 6 forgotten creatures that reveal what the Greeks feared most about the human mind. Before we start, likes and subscribes help me keep making these. Where are you listening from? Drop your city and time in the comments. I'm always reading them, thinking, wait, people in New York listen to history stories to sleep. Okay, tonight we are talking about 6 forgotten creatures from Greek mythology. But before we go anywhere, get cozy. Pillows good? Blanket situation handled? Perfect. Trust me on this one. You think you know Greek mythology. You've heard about Medusa, the Minotaur, the Hydra. Everyone has. They're the ones that made it into the movies, the ones that got the spotlight, the ones that survived 2,000 years of retellings. But here's the thing about ancient Greece. It wasn't just those creatures lurking in the dark. There were others, dozens of them, hundreds maybe. Things that didn't get statues or epic poems or Disney adaptations. Things that were too strange, too unsettling, too quietly horrifying to become famous. And tonight, you're going to meet 6 of them. But I haven't told you the most important part yet. You're lying there now, in the dark, and maybe you're already starting to feel that pull towards sleep. That's good. That's exactly where you need to be. Because these creatures, they lived in that same space. The boundary between waking and dreaming, between the living world and whatever comes after. The Greeks understood that threshold better than almost anyone. They knew that the most dangerous things aren't always the ones that roar and charge at you with claws out. Sometimes, the most dangerous things are the ones that wait, the ones that whisper, the ones that slip into your mind when you're not paying attention. And these 6 creatures, they were masters of that art. Let's start with the first one, the Lamia. You might have heard the name before, but probably not the real story. Not the version that made ancient Greek parents check their children's rooms twice before bed. The Lamia wasn't always a monster. She started as a queen. Beautiful, powerful, loved by Zeus himself. And that's where her troubles began, because Hera, Zeus's wife, didn't take kindly to her husband's affairs. Never did. But Hera's revenge on Lamia wasn't swift or merciful. It was slow, calculated, cruel in a way that only a god could manage. Hera cursed Lamia to devour her own children, every single one, and Lamia did. Whether she wanted to or not, whether she screamed and fought against it or not, the curse took hold and she ate them, all of them. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine yourself in that moment, unable to stop, unable to look away? Can you imagine yourself in such a situation in 2025? The myth doesn't linger on the details, but you can feel them anyway, can't you? The weight of it, the horror that doesn't end when the act is over, but keeps going, keeps eating away at you from the inside. After that, Lamia changed, or maybe she was changed. The line gets blurry in Greek mythology. Her beauty twisted into something else, something that could still be beautiful if you weren't looking too closely, but wrong in ways you couldn't quite name. Her eyes stopped closing. Some versions say Hera took her eyelids as a final cruelty, forcing her to see everything, always, without rest, without sleep. And Lamia, driven mad by grief and rage and the unbearable weight of what she'd done, became a hunter. But not of men, of children, other people's children. She would find them in the night, in their beds, in the places they thought were safe, and she would take them, devour them, replace the grief of her own lost children with the grief of others, over and over, endlessly, because that's the only thing left that made sense to her. But here's where it gets stranger. Lamia didn't just kill, she seduced. She could still take the form of a beautiful woman when she wanted to. She could still charm, still lure, still make you think you were safe right up until the moment you weren't. Young men would see her on the road or in a tavern or at the edge of a forest, and they'd be drawn in. She'd smile, she'd speak softly, she'd make them feel seen, wanted, special. And then, when they were alone with her, when they'd let their guard down completely, that's when the truth would show itself. By then, it was already too late. You probably wouldn't survive meeting her, even if you thought you knew what she was. The Greeks told stories about Lamia to their children as a warning. Don't wander at night, don't talk to strangers, don't trust beauty that seems too perfect. But they also told the stories to themselves, in the dark, when they couldn't sleep. Because Lamia wasn't just a monster for children to fear, she was a reminder of what grief could do, what loss could turn you into if you let it. And that's the kind of fear that doesn't go away when you grow up. You're still here, listening, still drifting. That's good, because there are 5 more creatures waiting, and each one gets a little stranger than the last. The second creature is the Empusa, and if you've never heard of her, that's probably for the best. The Empusa was one of Hecate's servants. Hecate, the goddess of witchcraft, crossroads and the night, the goddess who ruled over the places where the world got thin, where the living brushed up against the dead without quite realizing it. And the Empusa was her hunter, her scout, her method of keeping mortals in line when they got too bold, too curious, too willing to wander into places they didn't belong. But the Empusa wasn't like other monsters. She didn't have one form, she had many. And that's what made her so dangerous. You're walking along a road at dusk. The sun's almost gone, just a sliver of orange on the horizon, and the shadows are getting long. You're tired, you've been traveling all day, and then you see her, a woman, standing at the crossroads ahead. She's beautiful. Not in an obvious way, but in a way that makes you stop and look twice. She's alone. She seems lost, or maybe just waiting for someone. You approach. You ask if she needs help. She smiles. And that's when you notice. One of her legs isn't right. It's not a human leg, it's bronze, or maybe brass. The metal catches the last bit of light, gleaming dully, and the other leg, it's not metal, but it's not quite flesh either. It's the leg of a donkey, covered in coarse hair, ending in a hoof. You freeze. Your mind tries to make sense of it, tries to convince you that you're seeing things wrong, that the light's playing tricks. But the Empusa just keeps smiling. And now you realize her teeth are a little too sharp, her eyes a little too bright, and the smell coming off her copper and ash and something rotten underneath. The Empusa fed on blood, but not just any blood. She preferred young men, travelers, people far from home, far from help. She would seduce them first, just like Lamia. She'd play the part of the vulnerable woman, the mysterious stranger, the lover you didn't know you were looking for. And once she had them alone, once they'd lowered their defenses, she'd drink. Slowly. She wasn't in a hurry. She'd drain them over hours, sometimes days, keeping them just alive enough to keep feeding. And when she was done, there'd be nothing left but a husk, a body that looked like it had aged 50 years overnight. But I haven't told you the worst part yet. The Empusa could shapeshift. She could be anyone, your friend, your lover, your mother. She could take their face, their voice, their mannerisms, and you wouldn't know until it was too late. The Greeks believed she could even invade dreams. You'd fall asleep thinking you were safe, and she'd be there, waiting in the dark corners of your mind, testing you, tasting you, deciding if you were worth the effort of a real hunt. There's a story, one of the lesser-known ones, about a young man named Menippus. He was a philosopher's student, smart, skeptical, not the type to believe in monsters or gods or any of the old superstitions. He met a woman on the road. She was perfect, beautiful, charming, interested in him in a way no one else had ever been. They fell in love, or at least he did. She took him to her home, fed him, made him feel like the center of the world, and he was happy. For weeks, maybe months, until his teacher Apollonius came to visit. Apollonius took one look at the woman and knew. He didn't say anything at first. He watched. He waited. And then, at the wedding feast, because Menippus was going to marry her, of course he was, Apollonius stood up and called her out, named her for what she was, an Empusa, a blood drinker, a ghost wearing a woman's skin. And the moment he said it, everything changed. The food on the table turned to ash, the wine turned to blood, the house, the beautiful, warm, welcoming house, flickered and faded, revealing itself as a ruin. And the woman? She screamed, not in fear, in rage, because she'd been caught, because her game was over, and then she vanished, just gone, leaving Menippus standing there, hollow-eyed, realizing how close he'd come to being devoured. Can you imagine that? Realizing that the person you loved, the person you trusted, was never real? That every moment you spent with them was just part of a hunt? The Greeks didn't tell that story to scare people away from love. They told it to remind people that not everything that looks safe actually is. That sometimes, the most dangerous things are the ones that know exactly how to make you feel comfortable. You're still here, still breathing slow, still drifting towards sleep. Good, because the Empusa isn't finished with you yet. Or maybe she is. Maybe she's already decided you're not worth the effort. Maybe she's moved on to someone else, someone more afraid, someone more alone. Or maybe, just maybe, she's still watching, waiting to see if you'll wander to the wrong crossroads one night. But you probably won't. You're too smart for that, right? The third creature is coming, and this one doesn't seduce. This one just takes. The third creature is the Keres, and they don't wait for you to wander into the wrong place. You're on a battlefield. Or maybe you're not. Maybe you're just lying in bed, heart racing from a fever, skin slick with sweat, body too weak to move. Maybe you're in a house where the plague has taken hold, where every breath feels like work, where the air itself tastes like decay. The Keres don't care where you are. They only care that you're close to death. close enough that they can smell it on you, and once they catch that scent, they come. The Keres were sisters, daughters of Nyx, the primordial goddess of night, not goddesses themselves, not quite. Something older than that, something more fundamental. They were spirits of violent death, of slaughter, of the moment when life tips over into something else. The Greeks described them as dark-winged, with gnashing teeth and claws like knives. They wore red cloaks, stained with the blood of everyone they'd ever taken, and they were always hungry. But here's what made the Keres different from other death spirits. They didn't just take you when your time was up, they fought over you, literally. If you were dying on a battlefield, surrounded by other dying men, the Keres would swarm, dozens of them, sometimes hundreds, all circling overhead like vultures, waiting for the exact moment when your soul started to slip free from your body. And then they'd dive. They'd tear at you with their claws, trying to be the first to claim you, to drink your blood while it was still warm, to drag your soul down to the underworld before any of the others could. Imagine that. You're lying there, bleeding out, and the last thing you see isn't the sky, or your comrades, or the face of the person who killed you. It's a swarm of black wings and red eyes and teeth, all fighting over who gets to finish you off. The Greeks believed that if the Keres got to you first, your death would be worse, more painful, more drawn out, because they didn't care about mercy or dignity or any of the things that make death bearable. They only cared about the feast. But I haven't told you the strangest part yet. The Keres didn't just appear on battlefields. They appeared in homes, in sick rooms, in places where people were dying slowly, quietly, without witnesses. Old people, sick children, women in childbirth, anyone who was vulnerable, anyone who was slipping toward that threshold between life and death, the Keres would sense it. And they'd come, not always visible, not always obvious, but there, hovering at the edges of the room, waiting, watching, patient in a way that only something immortal can be patient. Some Greek families kept charms to ward them off, iron nails driven into door frames, offerings of food left outside at night, prayers to Hecate or Hermes, asking them to keep the Keres away, to let their loved one die in peace, instead of being torn apart by those dark-winged things. But the charms didn't always work, and even when they did, you could still feel them out there, circling, waiting for the protections to slip, for someone to forget the ritual, for the door to be left open just a crack too long. There's a story, not a famous one, but it survived, about a soldier named Lycus. He was dying on the battlefield, gut wound, the kind that takes hours to kill you, and he could see them, the Keres. All around him, perched on the bodies of the dead, fighting over the nearly dead, their wings blotting out the sun. He tried to crawl, tried to drag himself away, back toward his own lines, back toward something that felt safe. But every time he moved, they moved with him, closer, circling tighter. And he realized there was nowhere to go, no escape, not from them. But then, one of his comrades found him, pulled him back, got him off the battlefield, got him to a surgeon, and Lycus survived. Against all odds, he lived, but for the rest of his life he said he could still see them sometimes, the Keres, out of the corner of his eye, just at the edge of his vision, waiting, because once they'd marked you, once they'd decided you were theirs, they didn't forget, they just waited for the next time you got close to death, the next fever, the next wound, the next moment when your grip on life loosened just enough for them to slip in. You're still here, still breathing, still safe in your bed, far from any battlefield, far from any plague house. But the Keres are patient. They've been patient for thousands of years. They can wait a little longer, and maybe, just maybe, they've already caught your scent. Maybe they're circling now, too far away to see, too quiet to hear, but there, always there, or maybe not. Maybe you're fine. Maybe you'll live a long, peaceful life and never come close enough to death for them to notice you. But you probably wouldn't know if they were watching. That's the thing about the Keres. By the time you see them, it's already too late. The fourth creature is different. It doesn't hunt in swarms, it hunts alone, and it's been hunting for a very, very long time. The fourth creature is the Mormo, and the Greeks didn't like to say her name out loud. You're a child, it's late, you're supposed to be asleep, but you're not. You're lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house settling around you. Your parents are in the other room, talking in low voices. You can't make out the words, but you can hear the tone. Serious, worried. And then your mother says something that makes you go very still. She says, if you don't behave, the Mormo will come for you. The Mormo was a nursery bogey. That's what scholars call her now. A creature parents invoke to scare children into obedience. Eat your food or the Mormo will get you. Go to sleep or the Mormo will come. Stop crying or the Mormo will hear. But the thing about the Mormo is that she wasn't just a story. The Greeks genuinely believed in her. And not just the children, the adults too, because the Mormo had been around for a long, long time. Longer than most of the other monsters. Longer than some of the gods. She was a queen once, or maybe a princess. The details get fuzzy the further back you go, but the story goes that she lost her children. Some versions say they died of illness. Others say they were killed. A few say she killed them herself, driven mad by grief or jealousy, or some curse from the gods. And after that, she became something else. Something that couldn't rest, couldn't move on, couldn't stop searching for what she'd lost. She became the Mormo, the child stealer, the thing that crept into nurseries at night and took children who misbehaved, who cried too much, who didn't listen to their parents. But here's what made the Mormo truly terrifying. She could change her shape. She could be anything. A shadow on the wall, a draft of cold air, a sound just outside your window that wasn't quite wind and wasn't quite footsteps. She could be your own mother's face, smiling in the doorway, except something about the smile was wrong, too wide, too hungry. And by the time you realized it wasn't really your mother, it was too late. The Mormo had you. The Greeks described her as having different forms depending on who was telling the story. Sometimes she was a woman with a grotesque face, eyes bulging, mouth stretched too wide, teeth filed to points. Sometimes she was beautiful but wrong, like the Empusa, like the Lamia, something that looked almost human until you looked too closely. And sometimes she was just a presence, a feeling, the certainty that something was in the room with you, watching, waiting, even though you couldn't see it. Children who were taken by the Mormo didn't die, according to some versions. They just disappeared, gone in the night without a trace, leaving behind nothing but a cold bed, and parents who would spend the rest of their lives wondering what they'd done wrong, what they could have done differently. Other versions were less kind. They said the Mormo ate the children, bit by bit, starting with the softest parts, making it last, savoring it. Because that's what happened when you became a monster. You stopped seeing people as people. You only saw what you'd lost, what you needed, what you were owed. But I haven't told you why the Greeks were so afraid of her. It wasn't just that she took children. Lots of monsters did that. It was that the Mormo was unpredictable. The Lamia had rules. She hunted at night. She targeted specific types of victims. You could avoid her if you were careful. The Keres had rules. They came for the dying, the wounded, the ones already close to death. But the Mormo? She didn't follow rules. She took whoever she wanted, whenever she wanted. Good children, bad children, it didn't matter. She was grief incarnate, and grief doesn't make sense. Grief doesn't play fair. Grief just takes and takes and takes until there's nothing left. There's a fragment of a poem, barely surviving, just a few lines on a broken piece of pottery, that talks about the Mormo. It says she walks with feet that make no sound, and eyes that see through walls. It says she knows when children are pretending to sleep. She knows when they're lying about being good. She knows when their parents have checked on them for the last time and gone to bed themselves. And that's when she comes. In the deepest part of the night, when even the dogs have stopped barking, when the only sound is your own heartbeat, and maybe, just maybe, the faintest whisper of fabric brushing against stone. You're not a child anymore. You're safe. The Mormo doesn't hunt adults. Probably. Most of the stories say she only takes children. But some of the older versions, the ones that didn't get copied down as often, the ones that only survived in fragments, those versions say something different. They say the Mormo takes anyone who's alone, anyone who's afraid, anyone who's lost something they can never get back. And that could be anyone, couldn't it? You, maybe, in the wrong moment, on the wrong night, when you're lying in bed, thinking about all the things you've lost, all the people who aren't here anymore. That's when she listens. That's when she decides if you're worth taking. But you're probably fine. You're listening to this after all. You're calm. You're drifting. The Mormo isn't real. She's just a story. Just a name Greek parents used to scare their children into behaving. Nothing more than that. Nothing to worry about. Unless, of course, you hear something. A sound that isn't quite wind and isn't quite footsteps. A shadow that moves when nothing else is moving. A feeling that someone is standing just outside your door, listening, deciding, getting ready to reach for the handle. The fifth creature is coming, and this one doesn't care if you're good or bad, it just cares if you're breathing. The fifth creature is the Strix, and it used to be human. You're standing at the edge of a village at twilight, the kind of small, forgotten place where everyone knows everyone, where the old ways still hold, where people still make offerings to gods whose names have been half forgotten everywhere else. The sun is setting, turning the sky the color of bruised fruit, purple and red and deep, deep orange, and then you hear it. A sound like wings, but not quite, too heavy, too deliberate. And someone next to you, an old woman maybe, or a farmer heading home, grabs your arm and pulls you inside, fast, without explanation. And when you ask why, they just shake their head and say, "The Strix is hunting." The Strix wasn't one creature, it was many, a whole category of them, scattered across the Greek world and beyond, into Rome, into the dark forests of the north. But they all started the same way. They were women once, living, breathing, human women. And then something happened, a betrayal, a curse, a choice made in desperation or rage or grief. And they changed. Their bodies twisted, reshaped themselves into something between woman and bird. Their arms became wings, their fingers became talons, their mouths stretched into beaks that could tear through flesh like paper. But their eyes stayed human. That's what people remembered most, the eyes. The Strix hunted at night, always at night. They couldn't bear daylight, some said it burned them, others said it just made them too visible, too easy to spot and kill. But in darkness, they were perfect predators. They could fly silently, their wings making no more sound than a whisper. They could see in the dark better than any owl, and they knew where to find the vulnerable ones, the babies, the sick, the elderly, anyone too weak to fight back, too helpless to run. But here's what made the Strix worse than most monsters. They didn't just kill, they fed, slowly. They would land on a roof or a windowsill, or the edge of a cradle, and they would drink. Blood, mostly. But not just blood, life itself. The Greeks believed that the Strix could drain the life force from a person over hours, sometimes nights, leaving them pale and weak and wasted, without leaving a single visible wound. A baby would cry less and less each night. An old man would fade faster than illness alone could explain, and people would whisper, "The Strix has been here." There are protective charms, of course. There always are. Hawthorn branches hung over doors, white thread wrapped around cradles, certain prayers, certain offerings. But the thing about the Strix is that they were human once. They remembered what it was like to be on the other side of those protections. They knew the gaps, the mistakes, the moments when exhausted parents forgot to replace a charm or fell asleep before completing a ritual. And they waited for those moments. Patient, hungry, inevitable. But I haven't told you the worst part yet. The Strix could speak. Not all of them, but some. The newer ones, the ones who hadn't been transformed for very long. They could still form words with their altered mouths, still remember human language even if they no longer remembered what it meant to be human. And sometimes, in the darkest part of the night, if you were alone, if you were vulnerable, if you were the kind of person they wanted to feed on, you might hear one. A voice outside your window, soft, almost kind, asking to be let in, promising comfort, promising safety, promising that everything would be all right if you just opened the door, just for a moment, just long enough. And some people did. Some people were so lonely, so desperate, so worn down by grief or illness or fear that they opened the door, they let the Strix in. And by morning, there would be nothing left but a body that looked like it had aged decades overnight, skin like paper, eyes sunken deep, lips drawn back in an expression that might have been fear, or might have been something worse, something like recognition, like they'd seen the Strix's face in those final moments, and realized they knew that face. Recognized it from somewhere, from someone they used to know maybe, from someone they used to be. There's a story, barely recorded, only surviving in a few scattered references, about a woman named Polyphonte. She was beautiful, devoted to Artemis, goddess of the hunt, sworn to remain unmarried, to reject men and domesticity, and everything that traditional Greek society expected of women. But Aphrodite didn't like that. Aphrodite, goddess of love and desire, didn't appreciate women who rejected what she offered. So Aphrodite cursed Polyphonte, made her fall in love with a bear, made her give birth to 2 sons, Agrius and Aureus, who were more beast than human. And when Polyphonte realized what had happened, when she understood what she'd become, she tried to kill them, tried to destroy the evidence of her curse. But Artemis stopped her, and as punishment for trying to kill the children she never wanted, the children that were forced upon her by a curse, Artemis transformed Polyphonte into a Strix, a creature that would spend eternity hunting children, feeding on them, taking from others what had been taken from her. It's almost poetic, isn't it? In that cruel way Greek mythology so often is, the victim becomes the monster, the hurt becomes the weapon, and the cycle continues, endlessly, because that's what curses do. They don't end, they just spread. You're listening to this in the dark. Maybe your window is open. Maybe you can hear the night sounds, wind, distant cars, the settling of your house. And maybe, just maybe, there's another sound underneath all of that. Wings, faint, far away, or maybe not so far. Maybe close enough that if you got up right now and looked outside, you'd see something perched on your roof. Something with wings and talons, and eyes that look far too human. But you won't look. You're too comfortable, too close to sleep. And besides, the Strix isn't real. It's just a story, just an ancient Greek superstition that died out thousands of years ago. Nothing to worry about, nothing at all. Unless you're the kind of person who's lost something, the kind of person who's vulnerable in ways you don't even realize, the kind of person who might, in a moment of weakness, open the door to the wrong voice. But you wouldn't do that, would you? The sixth creature is the last one, and it's the oldest, older than most of the gods, older than the stories that tried to explain it, and it's still here. The sixth creature is Lamashtu, and she didn't start in Greece. You're walking through a museum, one of those old ones with dim lighting and glass cases full of artifacts that have been there so long they've become part of the furniture. You pass Egyptian exhibits, Roman statues, cases of medieval armor, and then you come to a small section, barely more than a corner really, dedicated to ancient Mesopotamia, Babylon, Sumer, places that existed thousands of years before Athens, before Sparta, before anyone ever told stories about Zeus or Athena or any of the Olympians. And there, in a small clay tablet covered in cuneiform script, there's a description of something called Lamashtu. You lean in closer. The translation is old, faded, but you can still read it. She who strangles the child, she who drinks the blood, she who enters through windows, she who cannot be stopped. Lamashtu came from Mesopotamia, from the oldest civilizations humanity ever built. The Sumerians knew her, the Babylonians feared her, the Assyrians made amulets to ward her off. And when Greek traders and scholars traveled east, when they encountered these ancient cultures and their ancient fears, they brought Lamashtu back with them. They adapted her, changed her name sometimes, blended her with their own monsters, the Lamia, the Mormo, the Gello. But she was always there, underneath, the original child killer, the first of her kind. She was described as having the head of a lion, the body of a donkey, the feet of a bird, talons instead of hands. And she rode on the back of a donkey through the night, searching for pregnant women, for newborns, for anything young and helpless and easy to destroy. She didn't just kill them, she infected them, brought disease, brought fever, brought the kind of wasting sickness that doctors couldn't explain and medicine couldn't cure. Babies would die in their cribs for no apparent reason. Mothers would miscarry without warning. Children would sicken and fade, and no one would know why. But people suspected. People knew. It was Lamashtu. It had always been Lamashtu. But here's what made her different from all the other creatures you've heard about tonight. Lamashtu wasn't cursed. She wasn't punished. She wasn't a human who became a monster. She was born this way. She was the daughter of the god Anu, one of the oldest and most powerful gods in the Mesopotamian pantheon, and she chose to do what she did. Chose to hunt. Chose to kill. Not out of grief or madness or revenge, just because she wanted to, because it pleased her, because she could. The Greeks tried to understand her, tried to fit her into their cosmology, their understanding of how monsters worked, but she didn't fit. She was too old, too alien, too fundamentally wrong. She didn't follow the rules of Greek monsters. She couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't be tricked, couldn't be avoided through cleverness or heroism. She just came. And when she came, people died, children died, and there was nothing anyone could do about it, except hope that their protections were strong enough, that their prayers were loud enough, that Lamashtu would choose someone else's child instead of theirs. But I haven't told you why she matters, why she's the last creature on this list. It's because Lamashtu is still here. Not in the literal sense, probably not anyway, but in the way that ancient fears never really die. They just change names, change forms. The unexplained infant deaths that used to be blamed on Lamashtu became SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. The mysterious childhood illnesses became genetic disorders, became environmental factors, became things we can almost explain but not quite prevent. And parents still lie awake at night, listening to their babies breathe, terrified of the silence that might come if the breathing stops. That fear, that primal ancient fear that something might take your child in the night, that's Lamashtu. That's what she was. That's what she remains. There are still amulets, if you know where to look. Not in Greece, those traditions died out centuries ago, but in Iraq, in Syria, in the places where Lamashtu first emerged, there are families who still carry protections against her, inscriptions, prayers, small clay tablets that look exactly like the ones made 4,000 years ago, because some fears are too fundamental to ever completely disappear. Some monsters are too real, not in the sense that they have physical bodies, but in the sense that they represent something true about human vulnerability, about the things we can't protect ourselves from no matter how advanced we become. The Greeks knew this. That's why they imported Lamashtu. That's why they blended her with their own monsters, their own fears. They recognized something in her that transcended culture, transcended time. The fear of losing a child, the fear of powerlessness, the fear that there are things in the world, or beyond the world, that don't care about justice or fairness or whether you've been good or bad, things that just take. Because they can, because they always have, because they always will. You're lying in bed now, safe, warm, far from ancient Mesopotamia, far from classical Greece, far from any of the places where people genuinely believed in Lamashtu. But that fear she represented, it's still here. In every parent who checks on their sleeping child one more time before going to bed, in every person who's ever felt helpless in the face of random tragedy, in every moment when you realize that safety is an illusion, that control is an illusion, that the things you love most can be taken from you without warning, without reason, without mercy. Lamashtu knew that. She was that. She was the embodiment of every parent's worst nightmare, every caregiver's deepest fear. And the fact that we don't call her Lamashtu anymore doesn't mean she's gone. It just means we've found new names for old terrors, new ways to describe the indescribable, new explanations for the unexplainable. But late at night, when the rational mind quiets down, when the modern world feels thin and fragile, when you're listening to the sounds of your house and wondering what else might be listening back, that's when the old fears return. That's when Lamashtu stirs. That's when you remember that humans have been afraid of the same things for thousands of years, and maybe, just maybe, there's a reason for that. These are the 6 creatures, the forgotten ones, the ones that didn't make it into the movies or the popular retellings, the ones that were too strange, too unsettling, too genuinely frightening to become entertainment. Lamia, who ate her own children and then hunted others. Empusa, who wore familiar faces and drank slowly. The Keres, who fought over dying souls like scavengers. Mormo, who took the children who misbehaved, and sometimes the ones who didn't. The Strix, who used to be human and remembered it. And Lamashtu, oldest of all, who chose to be a monster because she could. They're still out there in a way, in stories, in fragments of pottery and half-remembered myths, in the fears that keep parents awake at night, in the shadows that move when nothing else is moving, in the sounds that aren't quite wind and aren't quite footsteps. The Greeks knew them, named them, tried to protect themselves from them, and failed, sometimes, often. Because that's the thing about monsters, they don't go away just because you stop believing in them, they just wait, patient, hungry, eternal. And they watch for the moment when you let your guard down, when you think you're safe. When you're lying in bed, drifting towards sleep, thinking about old stories that can't possibly be true. That's when they're closest. That's when they're real. Not as physical beings necessarily, but as possibilities, as reminders that the world is stranger and darker and more dangerous than we like to pretend. And that some of the oldest stories, the ones we've been telling each other for thousands of years, in different languages, in different cultures, with different names but the same essential shape, maybe those stories are old because they're true, not literally true, but true in the way that matters, true in the sense that they point towards something real about human experience, about vulnerability, about the things we fear most. Because here's what the Greeks understood that we've mostly forgotten. Monsters aren't just things that hunt you in the dark. They're explanations. They're ways of making sense of a world that often doesn't make sense. When a child died for no apparent reason, when a young man disappeared on the road, when someone wasted away from an illness no doctor could diagnose, the Greeks didn't just say bad luck or natural causes. They said Lamia. They said Empusa. They said Mormo. And in some strange way, that made it bearable. Not better, not acceptable, but comprehensible. There was a reason, there was a name, there was something to blame, something to try to protect against, something that gave shape to the shapeless terror of random tragedy. Modern society doesn't have that anymore. We have statistics, we have medical terminology, we have rational explanations for everything, or at least we pretend we do. But the fears haven't gone anywhere, they've just become nameless, formless. And maybe that's worse. Maybe it's easier to be afraid of something with a name, and a face, even a monstrous one, than it is to be afraid of nothing in particular. Just a vague sense that something could go wrong, that something bad could happen, that the people you love might not be there tomorrow and you won't know why, and you won't be able to stop it. The Lamia hunted because she'd lost her children. The Empusa hunted because she was Hecate's servant, because that was her nature, because the crossroads needed a guardian. The Keres hunted because death needed to be collected, because souls needed to be brought down to the underworld, because that was the order of things. Even Lamashtu, cruel as she was, had a place in the cosmic hierarchy. She was the daughter of a god. She had a role to play. These creatures had reasons. Maybe not good reasons. Maybe not reasons that justified what they did, but reasons nonetheless. Structure, logic, a place in the grand machinery of the cosmos. But what happens when the monsters stop making sense? What happens when tragedy strikes and there's no explanation, no story, no myth to contain it? The Greeks would have invented a new monster. They would have given it a name, described its appearance, created rituals to ward it off. We just say it happened, and try to move on. And maybe that's healthier, more rational, less superstitious. Or maybe it's just lonelier. Maybe it's harder to process grief when you can't blame it on something with teeth and wings and a name you can curse. You're lying there in the dark, and you're thinking about this. Or maybe you're not thinking at all, maybe you're just feeling it. That subtle unease that comes from being human, from being vulnerable, from knowing that no matter how safe you are right now, in this moment, that safety is temporary, fragile, contingent on 1,000 things you can't control. The Greeks felt it too. Everyone who's ever lived has felt it. The only difference is what we call it, whether we give it a face or leave it faceless. There's a word in Greek, apotropaic. It means something designed to ward off evil, to turn away harm. The Greeks were obsessed with apotropaic magic. They wore amulets. They painted eyes on their ships to watch for danger. They left offerings at crossroads and hung herbs over their doorways, and whispered prayers to gods they half believed in. Because even if it didn't work, even if the Lamia came anyway, even if the Keres descended despite all the charms and rituals, at least they'd tried, at least they'd done something. And doing something, even something useless, is better than doing nothing, better than just waiting for the monsters to come. We still have apotropaic rituals, of course. We just don't call them that. We lock our doors. We install security systems. We get medical checkups. We save money for emergencies. We try to control the uncontrollable, to protect against the unforeseeable, to make ourselves safe in a world that has never been safe and never will be. And maybe that's all the ancient Greeks were doing too. Maybe the monsters were just their way of naming the danger, of giving themselves something to push against, something to fight, even if the fight was futile. But at least it was something. At least the terror had a shape. But I haven't told you about the survivors yet, because there were survivors. There always are. People who encountered these creatures and lived to tell about it. They weren't heroes necessarily. They weren't Heracles or Perseus or Odysseus. They were just ordinary people who got lucky, or clever, or desperate enough to find a way out. And their stories, the ones that survived anyway, are almost more interesting than the stories of the monsters themselves. Because anyone can tell you about a monster, but how do you survive one? How do you look into those two human eyes of a Strix and walk away? How do you stand at a crossroads with an Empusa and see the sunrise? There was a woman named Chryses. No relation to the famous Chryses from the Iliad. This was a different person, from a different time, whose story was recorded in a fragment of a text that only survived because it was reused as scrap paper for a shopping list. Chryses was walking home one evening, alone, and she encountered an Empusa at a crossroads. The creature was in its true form, bronze leg, donkey leg, teeth like knives, and it smiled at her, asked her where she was going, offered to walk with her, to keep her company, the way predators do when they're playing with their food. Chryses knew what it was. She'd heard the stories, but she also knew that running would be useless. The Empusa was faster, stronger, could probably catch her in seconds if it wanted to. So she did something else, something unexpected. She started talking. She asked the Empusa about itself, where it came from, what it was like to serve Hecate, whether it ever got tired of hunting, whether the crossroads were lonely at night. Simple questions, human questions, the kind of questions you'd ask anyone you met on the road. And the Empusa, surprised by the questions, answered. They walked together for miles, talking. The Empusa told her about the crossroads, about the travelers it had taken, about the goddess it served. And Chryses listened, really listened, didn't judge, didn't run, didn't scream, just walked and listened and asked more questions. And by the time they reached Chryses' village, the sun was starting to rise. The Empusa looked at the horizon, at the gathering light, and then back at Chryses. And then it vanished, just gone, without a word, without taking anything. Chryses lived. She told the story to her grandchildren decades later, and one of them wrote it down, and it survived barely, for 2,000 years. The moral of the story, if there is one, is that monsters are lonely too, that even the things that hunt us are capable of being surprised, of being curious, of wanting something other than blood and terror. Or maybe the moral is just that Chryses got lucky, that the Empusa was in a strange mood that night, that if she'd tried the same thing a week later, or with a different creature, she'd have died screaming. The fragment doesn't say, it just records that it happened, that she survived, that sometimes, impossibly, people do. There are other stories like that, scattered, fragmentary, barely surviving in broken pottery and damaged manuscripts. A soldier who survived an encounter with the Keres by pretending to be already dead, lying motionless among corpses while the dark-winged spirits circled overhead, waiting for him to move, to breathe wrong, to give himself away. He lay there for hours, until dawn, until they left. And then he crawled back to his lines and never spoke of it again except once, years later, when he was drunk, and the memory surfaced like something drowning. A mother who drove off a Strix by singing, just singing, a lullaby so sad, so full of grief and love and loss, that even the creature paused, landed on the windowsill instead of entering, listened, and then flew away. The mother never knew why, never knew if the Strix had children once, before it transformed, never knew if the song reminded it of something, someone, some life it used to have. She just knew her baby lived through the night, and that was enough. A child who escaped Mormo by asking her about her own children, the ones she'd lost, the ones she'd killed, the ones she was searching for in every nursery she invaded. The question made Mormo pause, made her remember, made her something other than a monster for just a moment. And in that moment of hesitation, the child slipped away, ran, hid until morning, and survived. But for every survivor, there were hundreds who didn't survive, thousands. The monsters took far more than they spared. The Greeks knew that survival was the exception, not the rule. They didn't tell these stories to inspire hope, they told them to prepare people, to teach them that even in the worst situations, even when you're face to face with something that shouldn't exist, and definitely wants you dead, there might still be a chance. A slim one, a desperate one, but a chance nonetheless. And maybe that's all anyone can hope for. Not safety, not guaranteed survival, just the possibility that if you're clever enough, lucky enough, desperate enough, you might see the sunrise one more time. You might live long enough to tell the story, to warn others, to add your voice to the long chain of warnings that stretches back thousands of years. But here's what nobody talks about. Here's what the fragments and the damaged manuscripts and the stories written in margins don't usually mention. The survivors were changed. Every single one of them. You don't look into the eyes of a Strix and remain the same person. You don't walk miles with an Empusa and come away unscathed. You don't lie among corpses while the Keres circle overhead and then just go back to your normal life like nothing happened. The body survives. The mind survives. But something else. Something deeper. Something that doesn't have a name in any language. That part doesn't survive. That part stays behind. Caught in that moment. Frozen in that encounter. Forever. Chrysalis lived to be an old woman. Had children. Grandchildren. A long life by ancient standards. But according to the fragment, she never walked alone after dark again. Never. Not once in 40 years. And on certain nights, nights when the moon was wrong, when the wind sounded like wings, when the shadows moved in ways shadows shouldn't move, she would sit by her window and watch the crossroads. Just watch. For hours. Until dawn. Her family thought she was going senile, losing her mind, but she wasn't. She was just remembering, and making sure, making absolutely sure that nothing was coming back for her. The soldier who survived the Keres never fought in another battle. He deserted, fled, spent the rest of his life as far from conflict as he could get, became a farmer in some forgotten village where nothing ever happened, and people died quietly in their beds of old age. And even there, decades later, he would still wake up screaming sometimes. His wife would hold him and ask what was wrong, and he would just shake his head. Because how do you explain that you can still hear them? The wings, the sounds they made fighting over souls, the knowledge that they're still out there, circling, waiting for the next war, the next plague, the next opportunity to feast. How do you explain that you survived but you're not sure if surviving was actually better than dying? The mother who sang to the Strix never sang again. Not that lullaby. Not any lullaby. Not any song at all. Her voice just stopped working one day. The doctors, such as they were, couldn't find anything wrong. No injury. No illness. Just silence. She lived another 20 years without speaking a word, communicated through gestures, through written notes, through the kind of silence that becomes its own language, and people wondered what happened, what broke her, but she never explained, never wrote it down, never told anyone except her daughter, and only on her deathbed, and only in a whisper so quiet it might have been imagined. The child who escaped Mormo grew up wrong. That's the only way to describe it. He grew up, yes, became an adult, but something about him was always off, too careful, too watchful, too aware of things other people didn't notice. He never married, never had children, spent his life alone, moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. Because once Mormo has marked you, once she's decided you're hers, she doesn't forget, she just waits. And he knew that every night could be the night she came back, that every shadow could be her shadow, that every sound could be her sound. So he kept moving, kept running, until the day he died, alone in a room in a city no one remembered. And even then, even in death, his face was twisted in an expression of terror that the undertakers couldn't smooth away. But I haven't told you the worst part yet. The worst part is that the survivors knew something the rest of us don't. They knew that the monsters are real. Not metaphorically real, not symbolically real, actually real. Real in the way that stone is real, that water is real, that pain is real. And once you know that, once you've felt it in your bones, seen it with your eyes, touched it with your hands, you can never unknow it. You can never go back to the comfortable delusion that the world is safe, that monsters are just stories, that the darkness is empty. The rest of us get to pretend. We get to tell ourselves that these are just myths, just ancient superstitions, just stories primitive people made up to explain things they didn't understand. We get to be rational, scientific, modern. We get to believe that we've conquered the dark, that we've mapped the world, that there's nothing left to fear except the things we can explain and measure and control. But the survivors don't get that luxury. They know better. They've seen what's really out there, and they spend the rest of their lives trying to forget, trying to convince themselves it wasn't real, trying to fit back into a world that doesn't believe them and never will. You're lying there now, comfortable, safe, listening to this story and thinking how terrible that must have been for them, how tragic, how sad, but also how distant, how removed, how completely unconnected to your life, your world, your reality. And maybe you're right. Maybe these stories are just stories. Maybe the monsters died out thousands of years ago, if they ever existed at all. Maybe the survivors were just traumatized by perfectly ordinary events that they misinterpreted through the lens of superstition and fear. Maybe, probably, almost certainly. But then again, what if you're wrong? What if the monsters didn't die? What if they just learned to hide better? Think about it for a moment. Really think about it. The world has changed dramatically in the last 2,000 years. We have electricity. We have cities that never sleep. We have technology that would seem like magic to the ancient Greeks. We have light everywhere. Street lights, house lights, phone screens glowing in the dark. We've pushed back the darkness, claimed it, made it ours. And monsters need darkness, don't they? They need shadows. They need places where no one is looking. So maybe they didn't disappear. Maybe they just adapted, found new shadows, new ways to hunt. The Lamia used to hunt on lonely roads, in dark forests, in places where travellers were vulnerable. But there aren't many lonely roads anymore, are there? Not in the way there used to be. But there are other kinds of loneliness now. Digital loneliness. The kind where you can be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. The kind where you can talk to hundreds of people online and never really connect with any of them. The kind where you can disappear, truly disappear, and no one notices for days, weeks. That's a new kind of darkness, a new kind of shadow. And maybe that's where the Lamia hunts now. The Empusa lived at crossroads, places of decision, places where you had to choose which path to take, knowing that the choice mattered, that it would determine everything that came after. But crossroads aren't physical anymore. They're metaphorical, spiritual, professional. Every time you have to make a choice that will change your life, which job to take, which person to trust, which path to follow, you're standing at a crossroads, and maybe the Empusa is still there, still offering to walk with you, still wearing a familiar face, still smiling with two sharp teeth while you decide which way to go. The Keres fed on violent death, on battlefields, on places where people died in agony and fear, and we tell ourselves that the world is more civilized now, that we've moved past that kind of violence. But have we? Really? Wars still happen, people still die violently. The scale has changed, the weapons have changed, but the fundamental horror, the terror of dying in pain, surrounded by others who are dying too, that hasn't changed, that will never change. And maybe the Keres are still there, still circling, still fighting over souls. We just don't call them that anymore. We call them trauma, PTSD, the invisible wounds that soldiers carry home from wars that never seem to end. Mormo took children who misbehaved. But what does misbehaving even mean in the modern world? The rules have changed, the expectations have changed, but children still disappear, still go missing, still vanish without explanation. And we have rational explanations now: kidnapping, trafficking, runaways. But the core fear is the same, the terror that your child might be there one moment and gone the next, that something might take them, that you might never know what happened. That's Mormo, that's what she always was, just fear with a name, loss with a face, grief that walks on two legs and looks in windows. The Strix drained life slowly, night after night, until there was nothing left, and we don't believe in blood-drinking bird women anymore. but we believe in other things that drain you slowly. Depression, anxiety, burnout, chronic illness. The slow erosion of vitality that happens so gradually you don't notice until you look in the mirror one day and don't recognize the person looking back. That's the Strix. That's always been the Strix. Something that takes from you bit by bit, night after night, until you're hollow, empty, a shell that looks human but isn't anymore. And Lamashtu, the oldest, the first child killer, she never went away. She just became SIDS, miscarriage, stillbirth, childhood cancer, all the ways children die that we can't prevent, can't predict, can't control, all the ways parents lose children and never get a satisfactory answer to the question why. That's Lamashtu. That's what she represents. The fundamental unfairness of a universe that allows children to suffer, to die, to be taken from parents who would do anything, to save them. We've given her new names, new explanations, but she's still here, still taking, still leaving behind that same ancient grief. But I haven't told you the most important part yet, the part that matters more than all the rest. The monsters don't have to be real for the fear to be real. The Lamia doesn't have to actually exist for people to be terrified of her. The Empusa doesn't have to be a physical creature for the warning to be valid. The Keres don't have to be literal dark-winged spirits for death to be terrifying. The monsters are the fear. They always have been. They're the shape we give to formless terror, the name we give to nameless dread, the story we tell to make sense of senseless tragedy. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's necessary even. Because humans need stories. We need explanations. We need ways to process the terrible randomness of existence. We need to believe that there's a reason, a pattern, a logic to the horror, even if the logic is just there are monsters and they hunt us and sometimes we survive, even if the explanation is just evil exists and it has teeth. That's still better than nothing. Better than staring into the void and accepting that bad things happen for no reason. That children die, that people vanish, that life drains away, that the world is cruel and random and fundamentally indifferent to human suffering. The Greeks understood this. They created monsters not because the monsters were real, but because the fear was real. And the fear needed a shape, needed a form, needed something you could point to and say, that's what I'm afraid of. Something you could create rituals to ward off, even if the rituals didn't work. Something you could tell stories about, pass down warnings about, prepare your children for. Because if you can name the fear, you can face it. If you can see the monster, you can fight it. Even if you lose, even if the monster wins. At least you fought, at least you tried. At least you didn't just sit there in the dark, paralyzed, waiting for something formless and nameless to destroy you. You're almost asleep now, almost gone. The monsters in this story, Lamia, Empusa, the Keres, Mormo, the Strix, Lamashtu, they're watching. They always have been. They always will be. But maybe that's not as terrifying as it sounds. Maybe knowing they're there is better than not knowing. Maybe having names for them is better than just feeling the fear without understanding it. Maybe the Greeks were onto something. Maybe monsters are how we stay sane in an insane world. There's a question that nobody asks about these monsters. A question that seems obvious once you think about it, but somehow never comes up in the old stories. What did the monsters think of themselves? Did Lamia know she was a monster? Did she look at her reflection, assuming she could still bear to look and see something monstrous? Or did she still see the queen she used to be, the mother she used to be? Did she hunt children because she'd become a creature of pure instinct, or because she'd retained just enough humanity to understand exactly what she was doing, to know that every child she took was someone else's child, someone else's loss, someone else's grief mirroring her own? And did that make it better or worse? The Empusa served Hecate. That was her purpose, her function. But did she enjoy it, when she seduced those young men on the roads, when she wore their lovers' faces and listened to their confessions and drank them slowly over hours? Was that pleasure? Satisfaction? Or was it just duty? Just a job that had to be done because someone had to guard the crossroads and she'd been chosen? Maybe the Empusa didn't want to be a monster. Maybe she would have preferred to be something else. Anything else. But the gods don't ask. They command. And when a goddess tells you to hunt, you hunt. Even if it destroys you. Even if you hate what you've become. The Keres were born into their role. Daughters of Nyx. Sisters to sleep and death. And all the other primordial forces. They never had a choice. Never had the option to be anything other than what they were. Collectors of violent death. Scavengers of battlefields. Witnesses to humanity's worst moments. And maybe that's worse than being cursed. At least Lamia had it before. At least she knew what it was like to be something other than a monster. The Keres never had that. They were born into darkness and violence, and they would exist in darkness and violence until the end of time. No escape, no redemption, no possibility of change, just an eternity of circling battlefields and fighting over dying souls. Can you imagine that? Being trapped in your own nature, being unable to be anything other than what you are, even if what you are horrifies you. Mormo searched for her lost children in every nursery, every cradle, every small bed where a child slept, and the stories say she took those children, devoured them, replaced her grief with their parents' grief. But what if that's not the whole story? What if she was searching for her own children? What if some part of her, some fragment that remembered being human, being a mother, genuinely believed that this time, this child would be hers, would be the one she lost, and maybe that's why she couldn't stop, not because she was evil, not because she enjoyed it, but because grief doesn't make sense. Grief doesn't operate on logic. Grief is just a hole that can never be filled, no matter how many times you try, no matter how many substitutes you find. The hole remains, and Mormo knew that, and she searched anyway, forever. The Strix used to be human. They all did, every single one. Women transformed against their will, reshaped into something between human and bird, forced to hunt the very people they used to be. And they remembered. That's the crucial part. They remembered what it was like to be human, to have hands instead of talons, to speak instead of screech, to be welcomed instead of feared. And they knew what they'd become, knew what they were doing, could see the terror in their victims' eyes and recognize it, remember feeling it themselves, but they couldn't stop. The transformation was complete, the hunger was real, and being aware of what you've become doesn't give you the power to change it. It just makes every moment worse, every hunt more terrible, every victim more unbearable. And Lamashtu, the oldest, the one who chose this, who became a monster not through curse or transformation but through decision, through will. She was the daughter of a god. She had power, had options, could have been anything, and she chose to hunt children, chose to bring disease and death, chose to be feared and hated. Why? The stories don't say. They just record that she did it, that she enjoyed it, that she laughed while parents wept. But maybe that's not the whole truth either. Maybe Lamashtu became a monster because being a god was unbearable, because immortality is a curse, because watching generation after generation of mortals live and die and love and lose while you remain unchanged, maybe that breaks you. Maybe it breaks you so badly that the only way to feel anything is to cause pain, to take from others, to prove that you still exist, still matter, still have an impact on the world, even if that impact is purely destructive. But I haven't told you what this means, what it actually means. These monsters, all of them, were trapped. Lamia trapped by Hera's curse, the Empusa trapped by Hecate's commands, the Keres trapped by their own nature, Mormo trapped by her grief, the Strix trapped by their transformation, Lamashtu trapped by her choice that became her identity, that became her prison. They were all trapped, and maybe that's the real horror. Not that monsters exist, not that they hunt us, but that they can't stop, that they're locked into these patterns, hunting, feeding, killing. Not because they necessarily want to, but because they can't be anything else. Because transformation is permanent. Because curses don't break. Because grief doesn't heal. Because nature doesn't change. Because choices become destiny. The Greeks understood this better than we do. They knew that monsters weren't aberrations. They were inevitabilities. The natural consequence of a world where gods were cruel and transformations were permanent, and suffering was eternal. Every monster was once something else, someone else. And with the right curse, the right tragedy, the right moment of desperate decision, you could become one too. That was the real warning behind these stories. Not watch out for monsters, but don't become one. Don't let grief consume you like it consumed Lamia. Don't let duty erase your humanity like it erased the Empusas. Don't let your nature trap you like it trapped the Keres. Don't let loss define you like it defined Mormo. Don't let transformation complete like it completed for the Strix. Don't let one choice determine everything like it did for Lamashtu. You're lying there in the dark, and you're thinking about the choices you've made, the griefs you carry, the parts of yourself you've lost, the transformations you've undergone, the person you used to be versus the person you've become. And maybe you're wondering, how close am I? How close to becoming something I don't recognize? How close to being trapped in patterns I can't break? How close to being a monster? The answer probably is closer than you'd like to think. We all are. That's the uncomfortable truth these stories point toward. The distance between human and monster isn't as vast as we pretend. It's not a different species, not a different order of being. It's just a few bad decisions, a few terrible losses, a few moments when we chose wrong, or when wrong was chosen for us. And then one day you look in the mirror and don't recognize what's looking back. And by then it's too late. The transformation is complete, and all you can do is hunt and feed and try to fill the unfillable hole inside you, and fail, again and again and again, forever. But here's something the Greeks knew that we've forgotten. Monsters can be pitied, not forgiven, not excused, not welcomed, but pitied. Because once you understand that they're trapped, that they're suffering too, in their own way, it becomes harder to see them as purely evil. They're tragic, all of them, even Lamashtu, especially Lamashtu. Because she had a choice and she made the wrong one, and now she's locked into it forever. That's worse than being cursed. At least with a curse you can blame someone else. you can say this was done to me. But when you do it to yourself, when you choose to become a monster and then discover you can't unchoose it, that's a special kind of hell. There are fragments, barely surviving, mostly ignored, that suggest some Greeks tried to help the monsters. Not kill them, not trap them, help them. There's a reference to a priest of Apollo who spent his life searching for a cure for the Strix, trying to find a way to reverse the transformation, to give them back their human forms, their human voices, their human lives. He never succeeded. The fragments say he died old and disappointed, having spent decades studying ancient texts and consulting oracles and performing rituals that didn't work. But he tried. He saw something in those creatures worth saving, something human still struggling inside the monster, and he couldn't just walk away from that. There's another fragment about a woman, name lost, details scarce, who left food for the Keres, not as an offering, not as appeasement, just as kindness. She lived near a battlefield, saw them often, watched them circle and fight and feed, and instead of being terrified, she was sad. She saw them as what they were, creatures trapped in an endless cycle of violence and hunger. So she left food, human food, bread and wine and fruit, things they couldn't eat, things that wouldn't satisfy them. But she left it anyway, as a gesture, as a reminder that they used to be something else, something more. The fragment doesn't say if they took the food, doesn't say if they even noticed, just records that she did it, consistently, for years, until she died. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the gesture matters even if it doesn't change anything. And then there's the strangest fragment of all, a story about a man who claimed he'd spoken with Lamia, really spoken with her, not as prey trying to escape, not as a victim begging for mercy, but as one person to another. He found her, or she found him, at the edge of a village, night, deserted road, all the usual warning signs, and instead of running he sat down, invited her to sit with him, and they talked, about her children, about what Hera had done, about the centuries since, about the hunting, the killing, the endless grinding weight of being a monster. And according to the fragment, Lamia cried, actually cried, tears that shouldn't be possible for a creature like her, and she told him she was tired, so tired, and she wanted it to end, but it couldn't end. Curses don't break, transformations don't reverse, there was no way out, no way back, just forward, forever. The man asked her why she kept hunting if she hated it so much, and Lamia said, according to this barely surviving fragment that might be fiction, might be fantasy, might be the dying hallucination of someone she was in the process of killing, she said she didn't know anymore. It had been hunger once, then revenge, then habit, and now it was just what she was, what she did, the only thing she knew how to do, the only thing left of her. If she stopped hunting, she wouldn't be anything. She would just be a blank space where a person used to be, and somehow that was worse than being a monster. At least monsters exist. At least they have a purpose, even if the purpose is terrible. But nothing? Just void? Just absence? That was unbearable. The fragment ends there, doesn't say what happened to the man, whether he survived, whether Lamia killed him anyway despite the conversation, because monsters are monsters and nature is nature and transformation doesn't allow for exceptions, or whether she let him go, whether that one moment of connection, of being seen as something other than pure evil was enough to make a difference. We don't know. The text breaks off, the rest is lost, and maybe that's appropriate. Maybe some stories aren't meant to have endings. Maybe some questions aren't meant to be answered. But here's what the fragment suggests, what all these scattered references and half-remembered tales point toward. The monsters weren't happy, weren't satisfied, weren't content with what they'd become. They were trapped in their own monstrousness, prisoners of their own nature, and some part of them, maybe a small part, maybe a part they barely remembered, was still human enough to suffer from that, to understand what they'd lost, what they'd become, what they could never go back to being. And if that's true, if the monsters suffered too, then what does that make the world? Not a simple place of good and evil, not a clear division between humans and monsters, victims and predators, innocence and guilt, but something more complicated, something messier, a world where suffering creates monsters, and monsters create suffering, in an endless cycle that nobody chose and nobody can stop. A world where victim and victimizer can be the same person, just at different points in time. A world where transformation is permanent, but awareness remains. Where you can know you're a monster, and be unable to stop being one. Where you can hate what you've become, and still do what monsters do. Because what else is there? What else can you be? You're still awake, still thinking, still lying there in the dark turning these ideas over in your mind. And maybe you're feeling something unexpected. Not fear, not terror, but something else. Something softer, something that feels almost like sympathy. For creatures that hunt children, for creatures that drink blood, for creatures that exist only to cause pain. And maybe that sympathy disturbs you, makes you uncomfortable, makes you wonder what kind of person feels sorry for monsters. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the ability to see monsters as tragic rather than purely evil. Maybe that's what keeps us human. What prevents us from becoming monsters ourselves. Because the moment you decide something is purely evil, completely beyond sympathy, absolutely deserving of destruction, that's when you give yourself permission to become monstrous.
That's when the transformation begins. The Greeks knew this. That's why their monsters were always tragic, always had backstories, always had reasons. Not good reasons, not justifying reasons, but reasons nonetheless. Context, history, transformation. They were trying to teach something important. Not fear the monsters. That's too simple. But understand the monsters. Pity the monsters. Recognize yourself in the monsters. Because that's the only way to avoid becoming one. By seeing how easy the transformation is. How inevitable it feels once it starts. How permanent it becomes.
You stay with that thought for a while. The idea that monsters are not born but made. That something breaks first. Something bends. Something human is twisted just far enough that it can never quite return to its original shape. And maybe that's why Greek mythology is crowded with creatures that feel less like animals and more like people who went the wrong way at a crossroads and kept walking. Which brings you, gently, to the next forgotten creature. Not one of the famous ones, not Medusa, not the Minotaur, but a figure most people barely remember, even though the Greeks once knew her name well enough to whisper it. Empusa. She doesn't roar, she doesn't charge, she doesn't smash villages. She appears quietly, often at night, often alone, often beautiful, at least at first. Empusa is a shapeshifter, a companion of Hecate, the goddess of crossroads and liminal spaces, which feels appropriate. She belongs to places where things are already uncertain, roads at dusk, empty inns, half-lit rooms where you're not entirely sure what you're seeing. Empusa preys on travelers, not with brute force, but with conversation, with familiarity, with the illusion of safety. She laughs, she listens, she asks where you're going, and that's the trick, because once you answer, once you admit you're in between places, she knows you're vulnerable. Some accounts describe her legs as mismatched, one bronze, one donkey's hoof. Others say she reveals her true form only at the last moment, when it's too late to look away. The Greeks loved details like that, physical signs that something is wrong, if only you're paying attention. But here's the strange part. Empusa is not described as cruel, not gleeful, not sadistic. She feeds, yes, she drains life, but she does it with a kind of weary efficiency, like someone doing a job they didn't apply for and can't quit. You imagine her waiting by the road, night after night, the same questions, the same conversations, the same inevitable ending, and you wonder, did she ever get tired of it? Did she ever hope someone would notice the wrongness and leave before it was too late? Or was she trapped, like Lamia, inside a role that no longer felt chosen? The Greeks don't say, they rarely do, they just leave you with the image, a woman by the roadside, a traveler who doesn't make it home, and the uncomfortable realization that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sits down next to you and asks how your journey's been. And as you think about that, you realize something else. Many of these monsters aren't guarding treasures. They're not testing heroes. They're feeding on people who are already tired, already lost, already far from home. Monsters, it seems, don't hunt the strong. They hunt the in-between. And maybe that's another lesson hidden under the story. That exhaustion makes us visible. That loneliness makes us edible. That the road itself can be dangerous, not because of what lives on it, but because of what it does to you over time. You're still listening, still drifting, and I haven't even told you the most unsettling part yet. Because the next creature doesn't wait on the road, it waits inside the house. Meet the Mormo, or rather the many Mormos, because even the Greeks couldn't quite agree on what she was. A spirit, a demon, a bogey woman, a name mothers used when children wouldn't sleep, which already tells you something. Monsters that live in stories told to children tend to linger longer than monsters slain by heroes. Mormo is associated with fear, yes, but not heroic fear, domestic fear, the kind that creeps into quiet rooms, the kind that lives in shadows cast by oil lamps. She is said to frighten children into obedience, to punish disobedience, to whisper warnings in the dark. Sometimes she's described as Lamia's companion, sometimes as Lamia herself under another name, sometimes as something older, something that predates the myths and survives them. And that's the unsettling thing. Mormo isn't out there. She's in here, in the house, in the language adults use to control children, in the stories meant to keep you safe by making you afraid. You imagine a Greek child lying awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for footsteps that aren't there, hearing a name spoken softly, like a threat, and you realize that fear itself is being personified, given a face, a voice, a reason. Mormo doesn't need to attack, she only needs to exist as an idea, as a possibility, and that's enough. Unlike other monsters, she has no clear origin story, no single moment of transformation, which suggests something important. Maybe she was never human, or maybe she was so ordinary that no one thought to record what she used to be. A caregiver who frightened instead of comforted, a protector who ruled through terror, a presence that meant well and did harm anyway. The Greeks understood this too, that not all monsters come from divine punishment or tragic accidents. Some come from systems,
from habits, from traditions passed down without being questioned, from fear used as a tool. And here you are now, an adult, listening to a story about ancient monsters, feeling your body relax even as your mind turns over these old ideas. You're safe, you know that, but part of you remembers what it was like not to be, to believe in things that lived in the dark because someone told you they did. Maybe that's why these stories endure, because they grow with you. What scared you as a child becomes something you analyze as an adult, and somewhere in between the monster changes shape again. Mormo fades, eventually, like most childhood fears do, but the concept remains. Fear as control, fear as protection, fear as inheritance. And as your breathing slows, and your thoughts begin to blur at the edges, you realize something quietly profound. These forgotten creatures were never meant to be catalogued like animals. They were mirrors, reflections of the ways humans frighten, hunger, transform and justify what they do. There are only a few left now, and they're stranger than you expect. By now the pattern is starting to feel familiar. Monsters that aren't really about teeth or claws, creatures that exist less in forests and caves and more in habits, fears, and quiet moral compromises. And just when you think you understand the rhythm of these stories, Greek mythology does what it always does. It introduces something deeply strange, deeply specific, and oddly bureaucratic. This one is called the honor centaur. Even the name feels tired, half donkey, half human, completely unresolved. The honor centaur is exactly what it sounds like, the upper body of a man, the lower body of a donkey, not a powerful horse like the centaur, a donkey, an animal associated with labor, stubbornness, ridicule. The Greeks were very intentional with symbolism, and this choice was not flattering. These creatures lived at the edges of the known world, not quite wild enough to be beasts, not respectable enough to be human. They were described as crude, loud, impulsive, prone to excess, ruled by appetite. And that's important, because the honor centaur isn't dangerous because it hunts you, it's dangerous because it lacks restraint. You imagine encountering one. There's no elegance, no tragic beauty, no seductive transformation, just noise, smell, movement without direction, desire without reflection, a creature that acts first and never asks why. And the Greeks clearly meant this as a warning, not about animals, about people. The honor centaur represents what happens when reason loses control, when the thinking part of you rides on top, pretending it's in charge, while the rest of you drags everything wherever instinct wants to go. It's not evil, it's unbalanced. And perhaps that's the most unsettling kind of monster, not the one that chooses harm, but the one that doesn't choose at all. There are no heroic slayings of honor centaurs, no great victories. They're not worth it. They don't guard anything. They don't symbolize cosmic justice. They just exist as cautionary figures, as if the Greeks were saying, quietly, this is what happens when discipline disappears. You let that settle, because it's not frightening in a cinematic way. It's frightening in a familiar way. Everyone knows what it's like to feel dragged by appetite, by impulse, by exhaustion, to know what you should do and not do it anyway. And the honor centaur keeps walking, loud, unaware, certain of nothing except the next urge. As your thoughts slow, you realize how many of these monsters aren't external threats at all. They're internal failures given form, warnings sculpted into bodies so strange you remember them long after the lesson fades. And the Greeks, in their strange, patient way, left these creatures behind not to terrify you, but to remind you to stay balanced, to keep the human part in control, because once you lose that, there's no hero coming to fix it for you. You're drifting now, but there's one more kind of forgotten creature you should meet before sleep takes you fully. This one doesn't roar, it watches. The telchines are rarely mentioned, which feels appropriate, because they were never meant to be noticed. They came from Rhodes, according to some sources, or Crete, or the sea itself. Even their origin is unstable. They were craftsmen, smiths, artisans, makers of divine objects. They forged Poseidon's trident, Cronus's sickle, tools of gods, tools of endings. And yet, despite their skill, they were hated. The telchines were said to bring misfortune simply by existing. Their gaze caused crops to fail. Their presence soured weather. People blamed them for storms, for rot, for bad luck that couldn't be explained. Not because the telchines attacked, but because things went wrong around them. You picture them working quietly, bent over metal, focused, precise, creating objects that shape the world while never being thanked for it, only blamed. Eventually the gods destroy them, Zeus drowns them, or Apollo kills them. The stories vary, but the outcome is the same. The craftsmen are erased, because the world would rather lose its tools than endure the discomfort of something it doesn't understand. And that's the quiet horror of the telchines. They are monsters not because of what they do, but because of what people believe about them. They become scapegoats, walking explanations for chaos, a way to give shape to randomness, because it's easier to blame a creature than to accept that the world is unpredictable. You think about that as your breathing evens out, about how often humans do this, how often discomfort turns into accusation, how often misfortune needs a face. The Telchines didn't hunt, didn't seduce, didn't terrify children into obedience. They just worked, and were punished for the fear they inspired by being different. Greek monsters aren't always warnings about what you might become. Sometimes they're warnings about what you might destroy. And now the stories begin to thin, the edges soften, the monsters feel less distinct, more symbolic, more dreamlike, which is exactly where they belong. Because you're close to sleep now, and in that space between waking and dreaming, myth and meaning blur together. Creatures lose their sharp outlines, lessons turn into feelings, fear becomes curiosity, curiosity becomes quiet understanding. There are still more forgotten beings waiting, but for now, you can rest with this thought. The Greeks didn't tell monster stories to scare themselves, they told them to explain themselves. And that somehow makes them easier to live with. When you're ready, we can continue. There is one last category of forgotten creatures the Greeks liked to hide in plain sight. Beings that don't attack you directly, don't seduce you, don't punish you, they simply are. And the discomfort comes from realizing how long they've been there, unnoticed, doing exactly what they were designed to do. These are the Keres, not a single monster but many, spirits of violent death, not the peaceful kind, not the kind that comes with old age or closure or time to say goodbye, the sudden kind, the messy kind, the kind that interrupts life mid-sentence. They hover over battlefields, over accidents, over moments when things go wrong faster than anyone can react. The Keres don't cause death. That's important. They don't start wars, they don't push blades, they don't trip soldiers, they wait. And when death arrives, they claim what's already fallen. The Greeks imagined them as women with dark wings and blood-stained mouths, which sounds dramatic, but their function is strangely administrative. They sort, they collect, they move on. No judgment, no emotion, just completion. You think about how unsettling that is. Monsters who don't hate you, don't want anything from you, don't even notice you until it's time, and then they're very efficient. Homer describes them fighting over corpses, tugging souls from bodies like workers arguing over assignments. It's grotesque, yes, but also oddly mundane. Death as labor, violence as routine. And maybe that's what the Greeks were trying to process. The fact that death, especially violent death, doesn't feel meaningful when you're close to it. It feels mechanical, sudden, unfair, uninterested in your plans. The Keres are what happens when humans stop trying to explain death morally and start acknowledging it practically. No lessons, no redemption arcs, just aftermath. You lie there, listening, realizing how different this is from modern stories. There's no comfort here, no silver lining, just the quiet admission that some endings are abrupt and nobody learns anything from them. And somehow, that honesty is calming. Because if monsters aren't always symbolic punishments, then maybe suffering isn't always deserved. Maybe sometimes things just happen, and all anyone can do is witness them, record them, and eventually, sleep. Your thoughts feel heavier now, slower. The edges of the story are softening again, but there's one final forgotten creature left, and it's the strangest of all. Because it doesn't live in the myth, it lives in the silence between myths.
The last creature has no single name, which is why it's so easy to forget. Sometimes it's called a daimon, sometimes an agos. Sometimes it doesn't get a label at all. It's the thing that lingers after the story ends. The presence that isn't a god, isn't a monster, isn't human either. It's fate, but personal. Not destiny carved into the universe, just the quiet pressure of events pushing someone toward a moment they don't fully understand until they're already inside it. The Greeks believed everyone had something like this. A guiding force, or a weighing force. Something that nudged rather than commanded. And this is where all the monster stories quietly point. Because transformation doesn't usually come from nowhere. It comes from repetition, from small decisions, from moments ignored, from suffering that isn't addressed until it hardens. The forgotten creatures are what happens when that process becomes visible, when inner states spill outward, when fear grows teeth, when grief grows wings, when hunger grows a body and walks away from you. And now, finally, the list feels complete. Not because there are only 6 creatures, but because you understand the pattern. Monsters aren't interruptions to the human story, they're extensions of it. The Greeks weren't asking you to memorize names. They were asking you to pay attention, to notice when empathy fades, when restraint weakens, when fear becomes a tool instead of a warning. You're very close to sleep now. The images are loosening, the meanings are dissolving into feeling. The monsters no longer stand apart. They drift, they blend, they become abstract again, as they were always meant to be. And maybe tomorrow, when you wake up, you won't remember every creature, or every lesson, or every name. But you might remember this. That understanding monsters doesn't make you weak, it makes you careful. And careful people, the Greeks believed, were the least likely to become monsters at all. At this point, the stories begin to feel less like a list, and more like a slow tide pulling everything together. The borders between creatures blur, names matter less. What remains is the sensation the Greeks seemed obsessed with capturing, the moment just before something changes. Because not all monsters were fully formed beings, some existed only briefly, transitional figures, warnings frozen mid-transformation. Take the Elodies. Not quite monsters, not quite gods. Twin giants Otus and Ephialtes, who decided, quite calmly, that the gods were in the way. They weren't driven by madness or hunger or tragedy, just ambition, curiosity, the belief that if something exists above you, it must be reachable. They stacked mountains, literally, Pelion on Ossa, Ossa on Olympus, a childish solution to a cosmic problem. If you can't reach the gods, build higher. And that detail is important, because it's not violent, it's almost innocent, the kind of logic a tired human brain might use when it's convinced effort alone can solve anything. The Elodies weren't evil, they were naive, and that, in Greek mythology, is often more dangerous. They threatened Hera, tried to claim Artemis, acted as if the divine world was simply another layer of territory to be conquered. And for a moment, the myths say, the gods were afraid. Not because the twins were powerful, but because they didn't understand limits. That's what makes them forgotten. They don't fit neatly into the monster category. They're not punished humans, not beasts, not demons. They're a warning about overreach, about confusing possibility with permission. Eventually they destroy themselves. Trickery, confusion, a mistake involving mirrored reflections, and a spear thrown at the wrong moment. No heroic duel, no grand ending, just the quiet collapse of ambition that went one step too far. And you feel the familiarity of that too. The way exhaustion can make you believe you're capable of more than you are. The way pride can dress itself up as curiosity. The way limits feel insulting until they aren't respected anymore. The Greeks didn't need dragons to explain this. They just needed two brothers, a few mountains, and a failure to stop climbing. Your breathing is slow now, deep, regular, and somewhere in your thoughts the idea settles gently. Not every monster is born from suffering. Some are born from confidence that was never checked. And finally, there are creatures the Greeks barely described at all. Not because they weren't important, but because describing them too clearly would miss the point. They are Nursery, the spirits of dreams. They are rarely called monsters, but they belong here, because dreams, like monsters, distort reality. They borrow faces, they rearrange logic, they show you versions of yourself you don't entirely recognize. The Nursery slip into sleeping minds through gates, one of horn, one of ivory. True dreams and false dreams, the Greeks said. Messages and illusions, comfort and deception. And you never know which you're getting until it's over. That's unsettling, if you think about it. Because it means the Greeks believed your mind could betray you while you rest. or guide you, or rehearse your fears, or soothe them, and there was no clear boundary between those outcomes. Dreams could warn kings, or ruin them, could inspire journeys, or justify terrible decisions, and the Nursery themselves were neutral, messengers without intent, like the Keres, but quieter. You're experiencing that now in a way. The story is loosening its grip, images come and go, monsters soften into symbols, symbols blur into feeling, and that's where all of this has been leading. Greek monsters weren't meant to live in daylight. They belonged to thresholds, night, roads, homes after dark, battlefields after the fighting stops, the moment before sleep. They were tools for thinking, when thinking is hardest, when logic slows down and feeling takes over, when you're vulnerable enough to see parts of yourself you usually keep hidden. You're safe, lying still, letting the stories pass through you, instead of clinging to them. And if a shape drifts by in your thoughts, a wing, a shadow, a face you almost recognize, that's fine, that's normal. That's exactly where these creatures were always meant to exist. Not chasing you, not threatening you, just passing through, like dreams, like memories, like sleep itself. The closer you get to sleep, the more the Greeks seem to abandon clean definitions altogether. Monsters stop being bodies you could point to, and start becoming conditions, states of mind, atmospheres that settle over a place, and change how people behave inside it. And this is where one of the strangest forgotten creatures quietly waits. Her name is Hecate. She isn't a monster in the usual sense. No claws, no fangs, no wings, and yet she ruins more lives than most creatures combined. Hecate is the spirit of ruin, of blind recklessness, of actions taken just one step too far to be undone. She doesn't force you to do anything. She doesn't whisper commands. She simply clouds judgment at exactly the wrong moment. She makes bad ideas feel obvious, necessary, even righteous. The Greeks believed Hecate walked lightly, barely touching the ground, moving faster than human thought, which explains why, once she's passed through, people often say the same thing. I don't know what I was thinking. That sentence could be her signature. Hecate appears most often in moments of confidence, when someone feels certain, secure, when doubt has gone quiet. She thrives there. Because doubt, for the Greeks, was protection. Hesitation was wisdom. And certainty, absolute certainty, was dangerous. Even Zeus falls victim to her, tricked into making an oath he can't take back. And when he realizes what's happened, he throws Hecate out of Olympus in anger, casts her down to earth, which is where the Greeks believed she stayed, among humans, among people who make promises, take risks, raise their voices, and assume they're right. That detail matters, because Hecate isn't punished. She's relocated, as if the gods decided they were done dealing with her, but humans weren't. You can feel how modern this sounds, how familiar. The idea that disaster doesn't always come from hatred or cruelty, but from confidence combined with speed, from decisions made too quickly to feel the consequences. Hecate doesn't destroy villages. She destroys judgment, and then watches quietly as people do the rest themselves. There are no temples to Hecate, no rituals asking for protection from her. Because how would you? You can't guard against something you don't recognize until it's already happened. And maybe that's why she fades into the background of mythology. Why she's remembered less clearly than monsters with sharper outlines. She's uncomfortable. She suggests that the most dangerous force in the world isn't hunger or fear, but certainty without reflection. As you lie there, your thoughts slowing, you might notice how often the Greeks return to this idea. Balance, restraint, awareness. Not moral purity, not heroism, just the ability to pause.
Ate represents the absence of that pause. And in a strange way, she explains all the other monsters. The moment where transformation locks in, the step past the point of return, the decision that can't be undone. You breathe in, slowly, breathe out. Even that small rhythm feels like resistance to her, proof that slowing down matters. The Greeks didn't imagine monsters appearing out of nowhere. They imagined them arriving when someone moved too fast to notice what they were becoming. And now, very gently, Ate drifts out of focus. Not defeated, just uninvited for the moment. Which leaves space for the next presence. One that doesn't rush at all. If Ate represents speed, then the next forgotten figure represents waiting. Her name is Nemesis. Most people remember Nemesis as vengeance, punishment, retribution. But that's an oversimplification. The Greeks understood her as something quieter and far more unsettling. Nemesis is balance restored, but without compassion. She doesn't act out of anger. She doesn't hate. She doesn't even judge in a moral sense. She responds, slowly, precisely, inevitably. When something grows too large, too proud, too excessive, Nemesis appears. Not immediately, not dramatically, but exactly when the scale has tipped too far to ignore. She is the answer to Ate, not as mercy, as consequence. And that distinction matters, because Nemesis doesn't care if you meant well. She doesn't care if your intentions were noble. She only cares about proportion, about balance, about the quiet rule that nothing gets to expand forever without collapsing inward. You imagine her watching, patient, almost bored, letting events unfold, letting arrogance stack up like those mountains the Alodes piled toward the sky, waiting for the moment where correction becomes unavoidable. When Nemesis finally acts, it doesn't feel theatrical. It feels final. A fall, a loss, a realization that arrives too late to fix anything. And that's why she frightened the Greeks more than violent monsters ever did. Because you couldn't fight her. You couldn't flee. You couldn't plead. She wasn't a creature you encountered. She was something you earned. There are no heroic victories over Nemesis. Only recognition, usually after the fact. She reminds you that the universe, as the Greeks imagined it, wasn't cruel, but it was indifferent to excuses. Excess invited correction. Always, sooner or later. You think about how exhausting that must have felt, living in a world where success itself carried danger, where rising too high made you visible, where pride wasn't just a flaw but a structural risk. And yet, there's something oddly comforting about Nemesis too, because she suggests order. A world where imbalance doesn't go unnoticed forever, where the scale eventually settles, even if it does so harshly. As your thoughts slow further, Nemesis doesn't loom. She recedes. Because sleep, like balance, requires letting go of excess, of tension, of striving. The Greeks filled their myths with monsters not because they loved fear, but because they feared chaos, unchecked emotion, unexamined certainty, endless growth without reflection. And now, lying there, warm, still, drifting. You're doing the most Greek thing possible. You're pausing, letting the scales settle, letting the monsters dissolve back into ideas, letting the night do what it's always done best, restore balance, quietly. As the night deepens, the Greek world grows quieter. Fewer gods intervene. Fewer monsters announce themselves. What remains are presences that feel less like characters and more like weather conditions that pass through human lives without asking permission. This is where you encounter the Lyssa. She is madness, but not the theatrical kind, not raving insanity or permanent loss of reason. Lyssa is sudden, temporary, overwhelming, a state that overtakes someone and then releases them, leaving devastation behind and memory intact. That's the cruelest part. Lyssa doesn't erase awareness, she hijacks it. She appears in stories where people do things they later cannot forgive themselves for. Acts committed in heat, in fury, in a moment where emotion moves faster than thought. The Greeks describe her as unleashed by gods, but only because they needed a source, something to point to when behavior became inexplicable. Hera sends Lyssa to Heracles, not to kill him, but to make him kill. In a moment that lasts only minutes, perhaps less, Heracles murders his own family. When Lyssa leaves, she does not take the consequences with her. She vanishes, cleanly, efficiently, and Heracles is left standing in the wreckage of actions he remembers committing, fully conscious, fully horrified. The Greeks understood this distinction with chilling clarity. Madness wasn't always an excuse. Sometimes it was a condition, a force, a storm that passed through and left you responsible for what it destroyed. Lyssa herself is described as reluctant. She doesn't want to go. She argues. She claims this punishment is excessive, which is fascinating. Even madness, personified, recognizes when things have gone too far. That detail matters, because it suggests the Greeks weren't comfortable absolving people through divine interference. They acknowledged the force, but not the erasure of responsibility. You lie there thinking about that, about how often people say, "I wasn't myself," after doing something irreversible. How language reaches for distance, for separation, as if the act belonged to someone else. Lyssa sits right in that uncomfortable space. She says, "It was you." But also, something else was there. That duality runs through Greek mythology like a fault line. Humans are responsible, but not always fully in control. Monsters exist, but they are often invited in through cracks already present. Lyssa doesn't linger. She can't. Her nature is motion, surge, release. And maybe that's why she frightens in a way other creatures don't, because she feels possible, close, familiar. Everyone has felt that surge, that moment where emotion spikes and vision narrows and consequences recede. Most people pull back in time. Lyssa is what happens when you don't. As your breathing slows, her presence fades too, because sleep smooths sharp edges, softens intensity, restores proportion. And in that calm, another presence waits. Not explosive, not violent, but heavy. The final forgotten creature before the end is not a monster that attacks. It's a presence that stays. Her name is Oises. She is misery, distress, the deep lingering kind, not acute pain, not dramatic suffering, but the low, constant weight that settles in after everything else has happened. Oises is the sister of the Keres, of Thanatos, of sleep itself, which tells you something important. The Greeks placed misery alongside death and rest, not as an aberration, but as a natural condition of existence. She doesn't cause suffering, she inhabits it. When grief fades into dull ache, when loss becomes routine, when endurance replaces hope, that's where Oises lives. And unlike other figures, she is almost never described physically. No wings, no claws, no disguise, because misery doesn't need form. It announces itself through sensation, through posture, through silence. Oises is what remains after monsters leave. After Ate has passed, after Nemesis has corrected, after Lyssa has burned through a life, she is the quiet aftermath, the long-term cost. The Greeks didn't romanticize this. They didn't offer redemption arcs or sudden relief. Oasis is patient. She stays as long as she's needed, sometimes a lifetime. And yet, this is crucial. She is not evil. She is acknowledged, named, given a place in the cosmos, which means misery, to the Greeks, was not a failure. It wasn't a punishment for weakness. It was part of the human condition. That idea alone is radical. You imagine ancient people sitting with grief, loss, exhaustion, and instead of asking, "Why me?" asking, Oasis has come. Not to surrender, but to understand. Naming suffering doesn't remove it, but it makes it less isolating, less personal, less shameful. And that may be the final lesson of these forgotten creatures, that monsters aren't always things to be fought. Sometimes they are states to be endured, witnessed, allowed to pass when they're ready. As you lie there, close to sleep, Oasis does not feel threatening. She feels distant, softened by rest, kept at bay by warmth and breath and stillness. The Greeks filled their world with monsters so they wouldn't have to face chaos unnamed. They gave fear bodies, gave suffering voices, gave transformation stories. And now, as your thoughts slow into dream, those bodies dissolve again. The voices quiet, the stories loosen their grip. Nothing is chasing you. Nothing is demanding. The monsters have done their work. And you are allowed, finally, to rest. By the time the Greeks reached the deepest layers of night, they stopped inventing new monsters altogether. Not because they ran out of imagination, but because imagination itself was no longer the point. What mattered now was endurance. What remained after fear, after consequence, after misery had settled into something quieter and harder to name. This is where Hypnos enters, not as comfort, but as boundary. Most people think of Hypnos as gentle, soft wings, quiet footsteps, sleep as mercy. And yes, that version exists. But the Greeks also understood Hypnos as something far more powerful. Sleep is not rest alone, it is surrender. It is the moment consciousness steps aside and admits it cannot maintain control indefinitely. Hypnos lives close to death, close enough that ancient writers sometimes confused the two, twins, some said, or brothers, or reflections of the same force, experienced at different intensities. That tells you something important about how the Greeks viewed awareness. Being awake was not neutral, it was effort, and effort could not last forever. Hypnos doesn't attack you. He waits until resistance weakens. You've felt that tonight, the way the body eventually overrules intention, the way thoughts slow even when you're still listening, the way attention loosens its grip on narrative, meaning, sequence. That is Hypnos working exactly as designed. And here's the part most people forget. Hypnos was feared. Not because sleep is harmful, but because it makes you vulnerable. Because while you sleep, you are unguarded. Gods can act, dreams can enter, monsters can pass through unnoticed. Sleep opens gates. That's why Hypnos lives near the Nursery. Why dreams follow so closely behind him. Why nightmares slip through the same door as rest. You don't get to choose which arrives first. The Greeks didn't trust sleep blindly. They respected it, approached it cautiously, ritualistically. They knew once you crossed that threshold, you were no longer fully in charge. And that idea alone reframes everything. Monsters don't need to chase you if sleep will eventually take you where you're already unprotected. They don't need strength, they need patience. Hypnos represents the final surrender of vigilance, the moment the mind admits it can't stay sharp forever, that it must rest, even if rest carries risk. But this isn't framed as failure, it's framed as necessity. To resist sleep forever would be monstrous in itself. Endless alertness, endless control, endless tension. That way lies madness. Lissa again, Ate again. the cycle restarting. So Hypnos arrives not as enemy, but as release. You notice how your breathing has changed. Slower now, deeper, less deliberate. Your body is already choosing for you, letting go in small increments, a shoulder relaxing, a jaw unclenching, a thought drifting unfinished. This is where monsters lose their sharp edges, where claws soften into symbols, where fear becomes abstract, where stories stop demanding attention and start dissolving into sensation. The Greeks placed Hypnos here for a reason. After misery, after madness, after consequence. Sleep was not escape, but reset, not erasure, pause. And in that pause, monsters cannot fully exist. They need awareness, memory, structure. Without those, they blur. Hypnos doesn't destroy monsters, he dissolves them. And as you drift closer to him now, the world narrows gently. The myths loosen their hold. The lessons no longer insist on being understood. They've already done their work. Beyond Hypnos, the Greeks believed, lies a space that cannot be mapped. Not a place exactly, a condition. A quiet that doesn't belong to waking life, or death, or even dreaming in the usual sense. This is where the story itself begins to fade. Not end, fade. Because endings imply sharpness, resolution, closure. And the Greeks rarely offered that. They preferred continuity, cycles, states flowing into one another without clean breaks. This is the realm of Lethe, the river of forgetting. Most people think Lethe belongs only to the dead. Souls drink from it before reincarnation, washing away memory. But forgetting wasn't reserved for the afterlife. The Greeks believed forgetting was essential for the living too. Without it, grief would be unbearable, trauma permanent, identity frozen in its worst moments. Lethe is not destruction of memory. It's softening. Edges blur, details dissolve, emotional charge drains away. What remains is impression rather than image, feeling rather than fact. You're experiencing that now. Earlier you could recall every monster clearly. Names, functions, meanings. Now they're slipping. Not gone, but distant, as if viewed through water. You remember the idea of them more than their forms. That's Lethe working. And this is why the Greeks never treated forgetting as failure. Forgetting was mercy. Forgetting was survival. Forgetting was what allowed life to continue, without being crushed under the weight of its own memory. A mind that remembers everything becomes monstrous. A mind that forgets entirely becomes empty. Lethe exists between those extremes. She doesn't erase who you are. She loosens what no longer needs to be held so tightly. And here's the final, quiet truth the Greeks buried under all their monsters. The most dangerous transformations happen when forgetting stops. When pain stays sharp forever. When rage remains fresh. When humiliation never dulls. That's when people harden. That's when monsters stop being metaphor and start being behavior. Lethe prevents that. She allows rest to complete its work. As you drift now, your thoughts no longer follow a straight line. Images rise and fall without sequence. Monsters appear briefly, then slip away. Meanings flatten into texture, sound into rhythm. This is not loss. This is integration. The stories have moved from your mind into something quieter, something less verbal, something bodily, a sense rather than a lesson. The Greeks understood this too, that knowledge does not always need to be remembered consciously to matter. Some understanding only works if it sinks below awareness. And that is where you are now. Not awake enough to analyze. Not asleep enough to dream fully. Balanced on the edge. Nothing more needs to happen. Nothing more needs to be learned. The monsters are no longer watching you. They are dissolving. And you can let them. Because sleep, finally, is not a descent into darkness. It is a return, a soft undoing, a gentle forgetting of what no longer needs to stay sharp. And in that forgetting, the night holds you without asking anything in return. At this depth of night, stories stop behaving like stories. They no longer move forward. They don't introduce new characters or escalate tension. They begin to circle instead, repeating ideas in softer and softer ways, like waves that keep reaching the shore but never quite break. This is intentional. The Greeks understood something modern storytelling often forgets. The human mind does not need constant novelty, especially not when it is tired, especially not when it is full. At a certain point, meaning is reinforced not by addition, but by repetition with diminishing force. This is where Ananke belongs. She is not often counted among monsters, but she should be. Or perhaps she is the most frightening of them all, precisely because she lacks fangs or claws or wings. Ananke is necessity, inevitability, the thing that cannot be argued with. Even the gods obey her. That detail should give you pause. Zeus can rage, Hera can scheme, Athena can strategize, but none of them can undo what Ananke has set in motion. She is older than Olympus, older than morality, older than intention. Ananke is what happens when choice runs out. The Greeks did not see her as cruel. Cruelty implies intention. Ananke doesn't intend anything. She simply is. Gravity, but for events. The pressure that pushes stories toward outcomes no one fully chose, but everyone must live with. She appears quietly, often invisibly. A marriage that cannot be avoided. A war that no one truly wants but everyone participates in. A decision made years ago that finally arrives to collect its cost. Ananke doesn't punish. She completes. And in that sense, she is monstrous not because she causes suffering, but because she denies the comfort of alternative endings. There is no what if with Ananke, only what is. This is deeply unsettling to a mind that wants control, wants revision, wants escape. And that's why the Greeks gave her a name, because unnamed inevitability is terrifying. Named inevitability is at least comprehensible. You can feel her presence in the way your thoughts are no longer branching, no longer imagining different possibilities. The day is done. The night has unfolded exactly as it was always going to. You are here now, and no amount of reconsideration will move you backward. But here's the thing the Greeks also understood. Ananke is not the enemy of peace. Resistance to Ananke is. Suffering increases when the mind insists things should have been different, when it replays choices endlessly, when it refuses to accept that some outcomes were locked in long before awareness arrived. Ananke teaches surrender, not passive resignation, but alignment. The moment when energy stops fighting reality and instead flows with it. That moment feels like exhaustion at first, then relief. You may notice that now, the way effort drains from your thinking, the way questions no longer demand answers, the way it feels almost pleasant not to solve anything. That is Ananke releasing her grip, not because she is gone, but because you are no longer pushing against her. And in that acceptance, monsters lose their power, not because they weren't real, but because reality no longer needs to be negotiated. This is not despair, it is quiet. And quiet, to the Greeks, was sacred. When everything that could happen has happened, and everything that needed to be understood has already settled somewhere below the surface, the Greeks believed only one thing remained. Not a god, not a monster, not even sleep. But silence. They did not personify this silence. That's important. Silence was not given a face, or a story, or a lineage. Because the moment you describe silence, it stops being what it is. Silence is what exists when the mind no longer reaches outward, when it stops narrating, when it stops labeling. This is the true ending state. Not death, not forgetting, not dreaming, but suspension. A pause so complete it doesn't even register as an experience. The Greeks brushed against this idea rarely, carefully. They knew too much attention could disturb it, so they approached indirectly, through ritual, through repetition, through long nights filled with stories that gradually emptied themselves of urgency. That's what has been happening here. The monsters did not disappear because they were defeated. They faded because attention withdrew, meaning dissolved, narrative loosened. And without those things, monsters cannot sustain form. They require focus. They require fear. They require memory. Silence starves them. You are very close to that silence now. Thoughts still arise, but they don't complete themselves. Images appear, but they lack detail. Sensations float without needing interpretation. There is no lesson forming, no conclusion arriving. That is correct. This is not a cliffhanger. It is not an ending. It is the absence of both. The Greeks would have recognized this state instantly, not as enlightenment, not as revelation, but as rest in its purest form, the mind doing nothing because